So we're going to move into our next unit, Form and Function of Plants and Animals. Let's begin with chapter 40, which is the basic principles of animal form and function. So let's go over some definitions that you need to be familiar with. First, anatomy is the study of the biological form of an organism, while physiology is the study of the biological functions an organism performs. So anatomy is basically just the physical structure of an organism, while physiology is how that organism functions or works. Now, the comparative study of animals reveals that form and function are closely correlated. So basically, form fits function, which is what we are going to learn and see in this chapter and throughout this unit. So again, form fits function. So the form is for the specific function that needs to be performed. So here's a jackrabbit, and you can see it has very large ears. The air structure is used to keep the jackrabbit from overheating in the hot climates. So this is an example of how the form fits the function. So let's get into concept 40.1. Now, the way an animal interacts with its environment is affected by its size and shape, which has led to the evolution of many different animal body plans that are determined by the genome. There are different environmental challenges that animals must deal with. Physical laws put constraints on strength, diffusion, movement, and heat exchange in animals. Also, as animals increase in size, their skeletons must be proportionally larger to support their mass. So evolutionary changes reflect different species adaptations to deal with those environmental challenges. So once again, remember that form basically fits function, which can lead to convergent evolution, which is, remember, when a species has different ancestors, but they have similar adaptation, which we can see in these different swimming organisms or swimming animals. They include animals such as fish, mammals, and birds, and are all very different, but all are aquatic, and the limbs are geared towards them swimming. So the bird's wings are flippers so that they can swim, and the limbs of the seals are also used for swimming, okay, and same with the tuna. So all of them have different ancestors, okay, but they have similar adaptation, and so their form fits their function. So organisms must do a lot of things in order to survive, to keep their metabolism going, which includes exchanging materials with the environment, such as nutrients, waste products, and gases. Now, the rate of exchange is proportional to the cell's surface area, while the amount of exchange material is proportional to the cell's volume. So let's talk about how different organisms exchange material with their environment. Single-cell protists just exchange with the medium that they are living in. Now, multicellular organisms that have a sac-like body plan have body walls that are only 2 cells thick, so this enables the diffusion of materials easily. So here shows how a single-cell protist just exchanges with the medium that they are living in, while multicellular organisms with a sac-like body plan have only walls that are 2 cells thick, okay, which allows the diffusion of stuff. So, in flat animals such as tapeworm, the distance between the cells and the environment is minimized. Then, in more complex organisms, there's highly folded internal spaces that provides for exchange of material. So here's figure 40.4, which shows the folded internal spaces that are found in multicellular animals such as ourselves. Now this is used again to exchange materials. In vertebrates, the space between the cells is filled with interstitial fluid, which allows for the movement of materials into and out of the cells. A complex body plan helps an animal living in a changing environment maintain a relatively stable internal environment. Let's briefly go over the levels of biological organization. Now, this is something you guys should have learned last year, so you may want to review it in depth again if you're unsure about it. So cells group together to make tissues, and tissues group together to make organs, and organs group together to make our organ systems, and the systems finally work together to form the complete organism. Now, this is true in both plants and animals, okay? Now, some organisms, such as the pancreas, may belong to more than one system. And remember, in most animals, there are specialized or they are certain cells that perform a certain job. Okay, so we have specialized cells that group to form our specialized tissues that in turn form our organs. Here's table 40.1, which shows and explains the organ systems in mammals, which we're going to go over detail in the next week, and we're going to concentrate on the ones that are important for our class. So let's talk about animal tissues. Remember we said that tissues are going to be groups of cells, specialized cells that work together to do a certain function. Now, different tissues have different structures which depend on that specific function. And there are four main categories of tissues found in animals. They are epidural, connective, muscle, and nervous. So let's briefly talk about each type of tissue. Epidural tissue covers the outside of the body and also lines the internal organs and cavities within the body, such as the stomach and the intestines. It contains cells that are very closely joined. Now, the shape of the epidural cells can be cube-shaped like a dice, or they can be bricks, or they can be like floor tiles, very thin. So the form and the function of the epidural cells depends on where they are. For example, the epidural cells on the skin are many layers thick, or what we call stratified, because it has to form a protective layer. But on the inside of the body, they tend to be simple or single cell layers because they are geared towards exchange of gases and other materials, so they don't want to have a whole bunch of cell layers to move things through. So here is the epidural tissue, and you can see how the form of the epidural tissue depends on their function. So as we said, form fits the function. Okay, the next type of tissue let's talk about is connective tissue. Connective tissue mainly binds and supports other tissues. It contains sparsely packed cells scattered throughout the extracellular matrix. Now, this matrix consists of liquids, jelly-like, or solid formations. So there are three types of connective tissue fiber, which are all made of protein. The first is collagenous fibers, and this provides strength and flexibility. And we can find this at the front of your nose or at the bottom of your ears. Then you have elastic fibers, which are able to stretch and snap back to their original length. And they're usually associated with our muscles. Then we have reticular fibers, which join connective tissue to other adjacent tissues. Now, there are two types of cells in connective tissue: fibroblasts and macrophages. Fibroblasts secrete the protein of extracellular fibers, while macrophages are involved in the immune system which is going to be the next chapter that we talk about. So in vertebrates, there are 6 major types of connective tissue. First, there's loose connective tissue. Now this binds epidural and underlying tissue and holds organs in place. Next is cartilage, which is a strong, flexible material that provides support. Third is a fibrous connective tissue, and this is found in the tendons and ligaments. Now tendons attach muscle to bones, and ligaments connect bone to bones at the joint. Think L for like, and ligaments connect bone to bone, they're like. The fourth type of connective tissue is adipose tissue or fat tissue, and this stores fat for insulation and for fuel. The next type of tissue is blood, and this is composed of blood cells and blood fragments from blood plasma. Now bone, which is a mineralized form, is also tissue. So here, figure 40.5 shows the 6 different types of connective tissue that are found in animals. So we have blood, cartilage, adipose tissue, bone, fibrous connective tissue, and the collagenous fiber. So let's go into the next category of tissues, which is muscle tissues. Muscle tissues consist of long cells called muscle fibers that contract in response to nerve signals. So the muscle tissue is divided into 3 types: skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. The skeletal muscle is responsible for voluntary movement or the movement we choose to make. Now smooth muscle is responsible for involuntary movement, while cardiac muscle is responsible for the contraction of our heart. Cardiac means heart, so it's muscle in the heart or muscle tissue in the heart. So here are the 3 types of muscle tissues. So remember we said that we had skeletal muscle tissues, okay, which is responsible for voluntary. So that's going to be found in places like our legs or our arms, our limbs, where we choose to move those, okay? Then we have the smooth muscles, okay, and those are involuntary, and we'll find those like in our digestive tract. Our digestive tract works without our knowledge. We don't force it, it's involuntary, okay? Then we had our cardiac muscle, which again is just the muscle tissue that's going to be found inside of our heart. So the 4th type of tissue is the nervous tissue. Now the nervous tissue is responsible for sensing stimuli and transmitting signals throughout the animal. Remember that stimuli are conditions or actions that cause a response in an animal or an organism. So the nervous tissue is responsible for sensing something that causes a response and transmitting a signal throughout the animal to create that response. Now, nervous tissue contains neurons or glia cells. The neurons or nerve cells transmit nerve impulses, where the glia help nourish, insulate, and replenish the neurons. So here's our 2 types of nerve tissues. And we're going to go more into detail about this stuff when we get to the units that talk about that particular type of tissue in that system. Now let's talk about how the organ systems are related to the form and function of the animal. Control and coordination within a body depends on the endocrine system and the nervous system. The endocrine system transmits chemical signals called hormones to receptive cells throughout the body via the blood. A hormone may affect one or more regions of the body, and hormones are relatively slow acting, but they can have a long acting effect. Now, the nervous system transmits information between specific locations. The information conveyed depends on the signal pathway and not on the type of signal. Nerve signal transmission is very, very fast. Nerve impulses can be received by different types of cells, such as the neurons, muscle cells, which cause our legs and limbs to move, endocrine cells, and exocrine cells. So here's figure 40.6, and it shows the signaling of the endocrine and the nervous systems that is responsible for the coordination and control. So let's move on to concept 40.2. So animals manage their internal environment two ways, either by regulating or conforming to the changing external environment. So an organism that is a regulator uses their own internal control mechanisms to moderate internal changes when the external environment changes. So it uses its own mechanisms to keep the body balanced. Now, an organism that is a conformer allows the internal condition to vary with the external changes. So the internal changes will change as the outside changes. Now, animals may regulate in some environmental variables while conforming to others. So here we can see that the river otter uses a regulator to keep its body temperature constant, while the bass internal temperature changes with the environment. So organisms use homeostasis to maintain a steady state or internal balance regardless of the internal environment. In humans, body temperature, blood pH, and glucose concentration are each maintained at a constant level by homeostasis. So mechanisms of homeostasis help resist changes in the internal environment. So how homeostasis works is, for a given variable such as temperature or blood pH, there is a set point which is level when the body is in homeostasis. Changes above or below a set point serve as a stimulus. Now remember that stimulus are something that causes a response. Now changes that cause the stimulus are detected by a sensor and trigger a response which returns the variable to the set point. Now this is known as a feedback loop. There are two types of feedback loops: negative feedback loops and positive feedback loops. Negative feedback loops bring you back closer or back to the set point of the homeostasis. So it causes a decrease in the mechanism that caused the change from the set point. For example, when you are hot, your body temperature rises, so it is not at the set point. So mechanisms, the feedback loop causes mechanisms that cause you to sweat and bring you back to that set point. Then the positive feedback loop is when you go further away from that set point. So it causes an increase in the mechanism that caused the change from that set point. So our loops are dependent on whether or not we're going closer or back to our set point, or we're going away from our set point. Negative is we're going to bring it back to our set point. Positive means we're going to go away from it. So here's an analogy or a picture of a non-living example to compare to homeostasis that uses a negative feedback loop. The temperature can change or fluctuate above and below a set point, which is caused by a stimulus that the sensor triggers a response and returns the temperature to the set point. Okay, so Again, we're returning it to the set point, so it's a negative feedback. So let's continue to talk about positive and negative feedbacks. So negative feedback loops again bring you closer or back to that set point in homeostasis. So it causes a decrease in the mechanism that caused the change from that set point. Okay, so we want to stop whatever's taking us away from it because we want to get back to it. Then the positive feedback is when you want to go further away from that set point. So it increases the mechanism. So we want to continue to go away, so we're going to continue to increase that stuff so that we can change from our set point. Now, negative feedback loops help maintain homeostasis because it helps return the variable to normal range. We go back to that set point. Most homeostatic control systems function by negative feedback where buildup at the end product shuts off, okay, the system. Remember, our enzyme is actually controlled by our negative feedback, okay? We want to be at a set level of our enzymes, and when we get too much, it shuts it off and it tries to get us back to that set point. Now, positive feedback, on the other hand, is when we're going to amplify a stimuli, and it doesn't usually contribute to the homeostasis of animals. So, to go more in depth about the feedback control, please pause the lecture video and watch the Bosman video below. Now, changes in set points and normal ranges can be caused by age and cyclic variation. In animals and plants, the circadian rhythm governs physiological changes that occur roughly every 24 hours. The circadian rhythm controls the changes that happen during our 24-hour day. So here's figure 40.9, which shows the human circadian rhythm that controls the changes that occur in the body in order to maintain homeostasis. Now, sometimes homeostasis can adjust to the changes in the external environment, and this is called acclimatization. Let's move on to concept 40.3. So, thermal regulation is the process by which animals maintain an internal temperature within a tolerable range. So let's define endothermy and exothermy, or endothermic and exothermic. Endothermic animals generate heat by metabolism, and they include birds and mammals such as humans like ourselves. They are also called endotherms. Now, endothermic animals gain heat from external sources. The exotherms include most invertebrates, fishes, mammals, and non-avian species, so non-flying reptiles. A trick to remembering this is endo means inside, so if the heat is coming from inside from metabolism, while exto means outside, so the heat is controlled by the outside or comes from the outside. In general, exotherms tolerate greater variation in internal temperature, so the inside temperature has greater ranges, while endotherms are active at a greater range of external temperatures. Since they control their heat from the inside, they are able to go to many more environments since the temperature does not change with the environment. Now, endothermy is the most energy expensive when compared to exothermy. Endothermy wastes a lot of energy to maintain the internal temperature, while exotherms do not waste a lot of energy. So here's 40.10, and the walrus is an endotherm, so it controls its heat from within by metabolism, so it allows it to survive in harsh aquatic temperatures. Then you have the lizard, which is an exotherm. This relies on the environment for heat. It spends most of its day in the sun absorbing heat to keep the internal temperature correct. So let's talk about poikilotherms and homeotherms. Now this is where it gets a little bit confusing when we're talking about how animals maintain their internal thermal balance. So a poikilotherm is an organism the internal body temperature varies considerably. Usually the variation is a consequence of the variation in the immediate internal temperature. Now this is opposite to a homeotherm, which is an organism who maintains thermal homeostasis or internal thermal balance. Now many terrestrial exotherms are poikilotherms. However, some exotherms remain in temperature consistent environments to the point which they actually are able to maintain a constant internal temperature, so they are said to be homeotherms. So exotherms and endotherms can be poikilotherms or homeotherms. So here is a table that explains the different types of animals in reference to their internal body temperatures. Here we have the first box, which shows us an animal which is endothermic and homeothermic. Okay, and this is an animal that's going to maintain the internal homeostasis by generating heat from metabolism. Then we have the endothermic organism or animal and the poikilothermic animal, and these are going to be animals that also go through metabolism, but their internal body temperature varies. Okay, then we come over here, okay, to poikilotherms, okay, and exotherms, okay, and again these ones, their body temperature varies, but now they get heat from the outside sources. Then we have our last one right here, this upper right hand corner, which is an exotherm and a homeothermic animal. And these are going to be animals that maintain thermal homeostasis by gaining heat from external sources. So here's just a little picture of each type of that shows you different organisms that go through each type of condition in order to maintain the body temperature. In order to balance heat loss and gain, organisms exchange heat by four physical processes: radiation, evaporation, convection, and conduction. Here's figure 40.11, which shows the four heat exchange processes that occur between the organisms and its environments. This figure here explains each type of heat exchange. Now, if you're not familiar with these concepts, please review them or speak to me at a later time. So, heat regulation in mammals often involves the integumentary system, which is the system that includes the skin, the hairs, and the nails. There are 5 adaptations that help animals regulate their temperature. It is insulation, circulatory adaptations, cooling by evaporative heat loss, behavioral responses, and adjusting to metabolic heat production. Let's briefly talk about each. The first adaptation that helps animals such as mammals and birds thermoregulate is insulation. In mammals and birds, skin, feathers, fur, and blubber reduce heat loss between the animal and its environment. Insulation is especially important in marine animals such as whales and walruses. This is why they are able to survive in very frigid water, such as water around Antarctica. The second type of adaptation that helps animals regulate their temperature is circulatory adaptations. So regulation of blood flow near the body surface significantly affects how an animal regulates its body temperature. Now, endotherms and some exotherms can alter the amount of blood flowing between the body core and the skin to help regulate body temperature. In vasodilation, which is when the veins get wider, blood flows in the skin increases. This helps heat loss in order to cool the animal. In vasoconstriction, when the veins get smaller, blood flow in the skin decreases and lowers heat loss in order to maintain the body temperature. Now, the arrangement of blood vessels in many marine species and birds allows for countercurrent exchange. Now, countercurrent heat exchange is a common mechanism in organisms that utilizes parallel pipes or veins of flowing fluids in opposite directions in order to save energy and keep the organism warm. Countercurrent heat exchangers transfer heat between fluids flowing in opposite directions to reduce heat loss. So what does countercurrent heat exchange actually mean? Countercurrent heat exchange basically keeps an organism warm. We would see this in the legs of a moose, the feet of a bird such as this Canadian goose, and the flippers of dolphins and whales. It also is in the tongues of whales. So an organism wants to maintain heat in its body. An organism has arteries that are taking blood away from the body and has veins that are bringing blood back to the body. And so they wrap arteries and veins around each other so that they can exchange heat. What happens is when blood flows from the body that has high temperatures, flows next to blood that is cooler, going back to the body, so the heat will flow from the warmer area to the colder area and head back to the body. So most of the heat moves back to the body when the blood is transferred to the extremities or the limbs. So countercurrent exchange happens in whales' tongues. Okay, this is an example. As blood flows to the tip of the tongues, it is very warm because it's coming from the center of the body, and it flows parallel to blood flowing back to the body, which is cool. As the blood flows to the tip of the tongue, it heats up the blood returning to the body, exchanging the heat in order to save energy and conserve heat. So let's compare countercurrent exchange and concurrent flow to help make more sense. Parallel pipes that flow in the same direction are called concurrent, while countercurrent is when the parallel pipes flow in opposite directions. As you can see from the diagram, the concurrent flow is not as efficient as the countercurrent because the countercurrent allows for heat exchange and allows to retain more energy. Now, some bony fishes and sharks also can use countercurrent heat exchanges, and many endothermic insects have countercurrent heat exchangers that help maintain a high temperature in the thorax. Now, in order to understand circulatory adaptations further, please pause the video and watch homeostasis hugs. Now, the next adaptation that helps animals regulate their temperature is cooling by evaporative heat loss. When an animal is too hot, it is important for the animal to cool down. Many types of animals lose heat through evaporation of water through their skin. Also, panning increases the cooling effect in birds and many animals such as dogs. Now, sweating and bathing can moisten our skin, which helps us cool us down. Think about taking a shower when you're hot. The next adaptation that helps animals regulate their temperature is behavioral responses. Now, endotherms and exotherms have behavioral responses to control body temperature. For example, many terrestrial invertebrates have postures to minimize or maximize the absorption of heat. For example, here in figure 40.3, the dragonfly uses a behavioral response to regulate the body temperature. The last adaptation that helps animals regulate their temperature is adjusting metabolic heat production. Now remember, only endotherms use metabolism to provide heat for their body, so this is something that is done only by endotherms. Now, the adjustment of metabolic heat production to maintain body temperature is called thermogenesis. Thermogenesis is increased by muscle activity such as movement or shivering, as when you're cold. Now, non-shivering thermogenesis takes place when your hormones cause the mitochondria to increase their metabolic activity. Now, although thermogenesis doesn't take place in exotherms, some exotherms can shiver to increase body temperature. So let's talk about how an animal makes adjustments to their body temperature in response to the environment. Birds and mammals can vary their insulation to adjust to seasonal temperature changes. For example, bears or squirrels preparing for winter by bulking up on insulation or fat. Also, when temperatures are sub-zero, some exotherms produce antifreeze compounds to prevent ice formation in their cells. Now, thermal regulation is controlled by a region in the brain called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus triggers the heat loss or heat generating mechanisms. Now, fever is a result of change to the set point of the biological thermostat. Okay, when the body is in homeostasis, it can receive two types of stimuli. One will cause the response to increase the body temperature, and one will cause the response to increase the body temperature. Both are negative feedback loops, returning that temperature back to the set point. As you can see, that the stimulus causes the hypothalamus to trigger the heat loss or heat generating mechanism, which brings the body back to homeostasis or back to that set point. Negative feedback loop. So let's get into concept 40.4. So bioenergetics is the overall flow and transformation of energy in an animal. Bioenergetics determines how much food an animal needs. It is related to an animal's size, activity, and environment. Now, animals harvest chemical energy from food. The energy containing molecules from food are usually used to make ATP, which can power a cell, remember, from cellular respiration. After the need of staying alive is met, the remaining molecules can be used in biosynthesis, which includes body growth, repair, synthesis of storage materials such as fats, and the production of our gametes. Now, figure 40.17 shows an overview of bioenergetics of an animal. The animal takes in organic molecules in food, which then is used to harvest the chemical energy from food known as ATP. The remaining food molecules which you can see in the figure are labeled carbon skeletons, can be used in biosynthesis. So, metabolic rate of an animal is the amount of energy an animal uses in the unit of time. The metabolic rate can be determined by an animal's heat loss and the amount of oxygen consumed or carbon dioxide produced. So figure 40.18 shows a tank that measures the rate of oxygen consumption by a swimming shark, so the metabolic rate can be determined. So let's define two terms. Basal metabolic rate, or BRM, is the metabolic rate of an endotherm at rest at comfortable temperature. And then the standard metabolic rate is the metabolic rate of an exotherm at rest, okay, at a specific temperature. So SMR are going to be our exotherms, and our BMRs are going to be our endotherms. Now both rates assume that the animal is not growing, that it's fasting, it's not eating, and that it is not stressed. Now exotherms have much lower metabolic rates than endotherms as of comparative size. Now metabolic rates are affected by many factors besides whether an animal is endotherm or exotherm. The two types of factor are size and activity. Metabolic rate is proportional to the body mass to the power of 3/4. Smaller animals have higher metabolic rate per gram than larger animals. So it may seem, since a bigger animal actually has a higher metabolic rate, that they have higher metabolisms, but that's not true. Per gram, the smaller organism is going to have a higher metabolic rate. The higher metabolic rate of smaller animals tends to be for higher oxygen delivery, breathing rate, heart rate, and greater blood volume compared to the smaller animal. So, figure 40.9 shows the relationship of the metabolic rate and body size. The basic, or the BRM, metabolic rate is on the y-axis and body mass is on the x-axis. Okay, graph A shows the BRM in relationship, so the metabolic rate in relationship to body size, and you can see as the animal body mass increases, so does the metabolic rate. Now, if we compare it based on per gram, you can see that smaller animals have higher metabolic rates based per gram. Activity greatly affects metabolic rate for endotherms and exotherms. In general, the maximum metabolic rate an animal can sustain is inversely related to the duration of the activity. Now, different species use energy and materials in food in different ways depending on their environment. The use of energy is divided into use for BRM, or SRM if you're an exotherm, activities, thermoregulation, growth, and reproduction. So these are our energy budgets. Here, figure 40.20 shows the energy budget for 4 animals. As you can see, the energy used is divided into our 4 groups: our metabolic rate, our activity, our thermoregulation, our growth, and our regulation. So, torpor is a physiological state in which activity is low and the metabolism decreases. Torpor enables animals to save energy while avoiding difficult or dangerous conditions. An example of a long-term torpor is hibernation. So activity is low, so metabolism can decrease, and this is an adaptation in the winter when food is scarce. Now, Summer torpor, called estivation, enables animals to survive long periods of high temperature and scarce water. And then daily torpor is exhibited by many small mammals and birds and seems to be adapted to feeding patterns. The last thing this figure shows you the process in which an animal maintains homeostasis. The animal starts in homeostasis when a stimulus occurs, which is an internal action or condition. It causes a change in homeostasis. The stimulus is then registered by a sensor or a receptor, which then sends a message to the control center, which then causes a response that happens, which will bring the animal back to homeostasis, back to that set point which we want. And that's the end of that one.